Can you believe that over 2.5 millennia ago, the entire cosmic order held its breath for one single momentous birth? This wasn't just a prince entering the world. This was a cataclysm waiting for a trigger, a seismic shift in reality, a catastrophe no one saw coming, depending entirely on which path he chose. The air in the city of Kapilavastu was thick with anticipation and an underlying dread, fueled by whispers of a destiny so immense it could shatter the very foundations of the powerful royal Shakya line. His name was Siddhartha Gautama, and his entrance was marked not by a simple joyous ceremony, but by an immaculate, terrifying dream that instantly rocked the political bedrock of the palace walls. Queen Maya, radiant with the coming birth, dreamed of a magnificent snow-white elephant bearing a lotus flower piercing her side, a mystical sign that the royal sages immediately interpreted with spine-chilling finality. This child, they decreed, would follow one of two absolute paths, and the fate of the entire known world hung precariously in the balance of his decision. He would either become a Chakravartin, a world-conquering, unstoppable king who unified all lands under his golden wheel, bringing unprecedented political supremacy to the Shakya dynasty and securing the bloodline forever. Or, and this was the chilling dread that truly paralyzed the court and drained the color from the king's face, he would become a Buddha, an enlightened one, and forever abandon the throne, trading all earthly power, glory, and legacy for eternal transcendental truth. King Suddhodana, a proud and profoundly possessive ruler, heard this prophecy, and his ambitious blood ran instantly cold. He didn't hear glory. He saw the imminent catastrophic loss of his only heir, the swift and brutal end of his entire dynastic legacy. He refused, absolutely refused, to lose his prized son to the dusty, terrifying roads of spiritual poverty, to the unpredictable calling of the wandering ascetics. He would not allow the ultimate, inescapable truth of human suffering to steal his future. The king instantly made a desperate, tyrannical pact with destiny itself. He would manipulate reality, cheat the cosmos, and build a world so utterly perfect that Siddhartha would never, for a single moment, contemplate the existence of pain or the necessity of escape. Thus began the most monumental, psychologically complex architectural project in ancient history, the creation of the Golden Cage. The palace complex, vast and blindingly opulent, was surrounded by multiple towering walls, meticulously designed to perfectly replicate unending, effortless joy and completely eliminate the brutal, unavoidable realities of human existence. This was not merely a luxurious home. It was the ultimate engineered experience, a magnificent, sprawling simulation where sadness, death, old age, and sickness were not just irrelevant, they were myths, forbidden concepts, whispered only by the terrified, most ancient guards who remembered the world outside. No expense was spared in this frantic, desperate endeavor to rewrite cosmic fate. Every garden bloom was cultivated to absolute, vibrant perfection. Every musician trained to perform flawless, intoxicating melodies. Every servant and attendant was meticulously screened, not for skill, but for any discernible sign of imperfection, decay, or even the smallest flicker of melancholy in their eyes. The walls were patrolled constantly, not against intruders, but against the insidious threat of reality slipping in. A fallen leaf, a slightly wilted flower, a servant developing a cough. These were threats immediately dealt with, spirited away before the young prince's magnificent, pampered gaze could fall upon them. Siddhartha grew up in a sensory overload of constructed pleasure, immersed in silks, jewels, and endless feasting, trained in martial arts and statecraft, but always kept insulated from the one thing that defines the human condition: suffering. He was protected by 3 concentric rings of absolute, paranoid denial. The inner circle, his personal chambers, were a realm of perpetual spring and intoxicating youth. The middle circle, the royal gardens, were a place where all visible signs of seasonal change and decay were immediately erased. And the final, colossal outer wall, guarded by hundreds of the king's most trusted, fiercely loyal soldiers, stood as a defiant barrier against the inevitable encroachment of the real world, the world where men aged, where bodies failed, and where the relentless cycle of death claimed everything eventually. The king knew deep in his terrified heart that if Siddhartha ever witnessed the smallest crack in this flawless facade, the prophecy would be fulfilled, the palace would be abandoned, and the legacy would shatter into 1,000,000 pieces. The pressure on the staff was unbearable. Maintaining this lie required absolute vigilance, a collective conspiracy where thousands of people risked their lives just to keep one single exceptional man ignorant of his own existence. They built the perfect prison, designed to crush the spirit's natural curiosity under the overwhelming weight of endless, meaningless pleasure. But history has a way of mocking even the most powerful kings, and destiny always finds a crack to slip through the most elaborate defenses. The stage was set for the most dramatic, heartbreaking awakening humanity has ever known. And the king's golden cage was about to witness its own spectacular, inevitable collapse. King Suddhodana, the man who had seen the cosmic balance sheet of his son's destiny, wasn't just building a home, he was constructing a temporal paradox, a massive, gilded lie designed to cheat the universe itself. His fear was a tangible, crushing weight that settled upon the entire Kapilavastu kingdom, demanding absolute, unyielding adherence to the grand facade. Any whisper of suffering, any mention of death, age, or sickness was instantly punishable by exile, or worse. The royal decree was simple, terrifying, and absolute. Reality itself was banished from the perimeter of the prince's life. The guards weren't just protecting a prince, they were protecting an ideology. They were the silent enforcers of the king's perfect, manufactured reality, constantly sifting the air for any errant sigh or drooping flower that might hint at the true, messy nature of the outside world. This wasn't merely security. It was a psychological blockade, a systematic cleansing of all natural decay. The people tasked with maintaining the gardens had to replace any wilting bloom instantly, silently, before the prince's gaze could land upon it. If an old retainer showed signs of slowing down, they were immediately whisked away, replaced by a younger, more vibrant counterpart, lest Siddhartha see the natural progression of time etched upon a human face. To ensure no season brought monotony, which can lead to contemplation, the king's ultimate enemy, he commissioned not one, but 3 magnificent palaces, each a marvel of engineering and opulent dedication. These weren't mere residences. They were climate-controlled emotional ecosystems, tailored to perfection, designed to offer an infinite loop of comfortable, predictable joy. The palace of the rains, the palace of the winter, and the palace of the summer, known in the ancient texts as Rama, Surama, and Subhaga, a shimmering trinity of architectural defiance against the natural order of things. The sheer scale of the operation was staggering. Thousands of laborers toiled day and night, their sweat and exhaustion quickly hidden from the prince's view, lest he realize that hardship existed outside the walls, their true struggle forever erased by gold leaf and silk screens. Every stone, every silk curtain, every meticulously placed jewel was a brick in the king's desperate wall against enlightenment. Siddhartha, shielded from all reality, lived a life of sensory overload, a constant, dizzying festival designed to keep his mind busy, shallow, and purely materialistic. If the outside world offered spiritual realization, the inside offered unending, glorious distraction. He was given every comfort imaginable, perhaps every comfort unimaginable to the common man, a constant flow of transient pleasure meant to occupy the magnificent engine of his mind. His clothing changed daily, spun from the finest, rarest fabrics imported from distant lands, requiring an army of tailors to constantly refresh his wardrobe. His food was prepared by chefs whose sole purpose was to prevent boredom on the palate, offering complex flavors and textures that drowned out any call for simplicity or fasting, ensuring his focus remained terrestrial. The water he bathed in was scented with rare perfumes, and his sleeping quarters were so perfectly temperature regulated that he never experienced the discomfort of a chill or the lethargy of oppressive heat. But the king knew that material wealth alone was not enough to extinguish the flame of destiny. He needed human distraction, a living, breathing tapestry of perfection. Therefore, Siddhartha was surrounded by an almost unbelievable assembly of beautiful, talented, and carefully curated companions. Thousands of court dancers, musicians, and handmaidens, all chosen specifically for their ability to perpetually radiate youthful joy and perfection, creating a living, breathing bubble of artificial spring. These were not just servants, they were actors in the king's lifelong, terrifying play. Their lives depended on their smile never fading, on their movements always being graceful, on their youthful vigor never showing the slightest sign of eventual decay, lest they trigger the prince's fateful introspection. Imagine the psychological toll on these thousands of people, forced to live a perpetual lie of eternal springtime, knowing the penalty for letting reality slip was swift and brutal banishment from the golden circle. Siddhartha's education was equally controlled. He was taught philosophy, statecraft, martial arts, everything an emperor needed to know, but sanitized of any philosophical inquiry that might lead to existential dread or deep questioning. He was given knowledge, yes, but knowledge carefully pruned to serve the crown, never to question the crown. He mastered the arts of war and governance, excelling far beyond his peers. Yet he never once saw the true cost of conflict, the blood on the ground, the fear in the eyes of the defeated. He lived in a conceptual vacuum, highly skilled but deeply ignorant of the human condition, his power confined by the walls of his father's fear. As Siddhartha grew into a breathtakingly handsome young man, achieving unparalleled perfection in the physical realm, the king's anxiety only mounted. The tighter the cage, the more violently the spirit yearned for flight, and a strange, profound melancholy began to cling to the prince like morning dew, even amidst the most lavish festivals. He would wander the manicured gardens, where every leaf was perfect and every fountain flowed with rhythmic precision, and an unnameable sense of absence would begin to gnaw at him. He had everything, yet he possessed nothing that truly mattered, nothing that spoke to the deeper calling resonating within his soul. The king, desperate to anchor his son to the material world, decided the time for marriage was now, a strategic maneuver to bind him with familial responsibility. But even here, Siddhartha's unnatural abilities shone through. To win the hand of the beautiful Princess Yashodhara, he had to participate in a series of grueling tests of strength and skill against rivals from across the kingdom. He dominated every challenge: archery, swordsmanship, wrestling. He moved with the power of a god, proving that the king's sheltered life had not diminished his physical might, only sharpened his inner yearning for meaning. He won Yashodhara, a woman as beautiful and shielded as he was, creating the ultimate power couple in the perfect prison, designed to produce the next generation of captive monarchs. For years, Siddhartha lived this fabricated existence with his wife and the entire court, trapped in an endless cycle of feasts, music, and seasonal migrations between the three perfect palaces. He had children, he had power, he had boundless wealth, achieving the pinnacle of what his father defined as human success. But fulfillment remained a mirage, a cruel, shimmering trick on the periphery of his consciousness. The routine, no matter how golden, became suffocating. The music, no matter how exquisite, began to sound hollow. His deep, perceptive mind, the very thing the king feared, was beginning to turn inward, asking questions that the perfectly engineered environment had no answers for. The king's system was failing, not because of external attack, but due to internal combustion. Siddhartha was beginning to feel the agonizing, slow pressure of his own unexpressed potential. He felt like a magnificent arrow drawn back on the bowstring of existence, yet never permitted to fly towards its target. He started demanding to see the world outside the immediate palace walls, a request that sent seismic waves of panic through the meticulously organized court. The king couldn't outright refuse. That would only fan the flames of curiosity. So he consented, but only under the most impossible, rigorous, and terrifying conditions, setting the stage for the dramatic confrontation between the gilded lie and the brutal, undeniable truth of the world. King Suddhodana, now a man consumed by the chilling echo of the prophecy, began his tyrannical masterpiece. It wasn't enough to simply protect the boy. He had to architect a universe where suffering literally did not exist. A gilded cage so perfect that the concept of pain would be biologically impossible for his son to grasp. He didn't just rule Kapilavastu, he weaponized it. His fear was the hammer, and the entire kingdom was the anvil upon which destiny was being violently reshaped. The sage's words, "He will be the greatest emperor or the greatest beggar," were the curse that drove him mad with paranoia and power. The architectural monstrosity that followed was known as the Three Palaces, 3 separate citadels of impossible luxury, each one dedicated to eliminating the sensory discomfort of a specific season. This was not a home, it was a fortress against the truth. The king commanded his architects to build a world that existed only in the present tense, a place where the signs of aging or decay were systematically erased before Siddhartha's eye could even register them. The summer palace, built of cool white marble and adorned with subterranean water gardens, ensured that the brutal heat of the plains never touched the prince's brow. The winter palace, constructed from rich, dark woods and heavy tapestries, was perpetually warm and vibrant, warding off the chill that might remind one of nature's harsh indifference. And the palace for the rainy season, towering and open to catch the fresh air, was a masterpiece of fleeting, glorious distraction. He commissioned thousands of the greatest artisans, not to build beauty, but to engineer sensory overload, a perpetual state of euphoria that would drown out the quiet whisper of mortality. Every statue depicted victory, every mural displayed joy, every fountain flowed with perfumed water, never just water. The very soil around the palace walls was screened for imperfections. Every pebble that suggested harshness or irregularity was meticulously removed, lest the prince stumble upon a natural element that spoke of decay. This was purification taken to a terrifying extreme, a forced aesthetic conformity that screamed of the king's desperation. But the architecture was only the shell. A true genius of Suddhodana's tyranny lay in the living ecosystem he constructed around Siddhartha, the human wall of denial. He decreed that no servant, no guard, no musician and no dancer within the palace walls could show any sign of age, sickness, or sadness. The selection process was horrifyingly rigorous. Only the young, the healthy, and the radiantly beautiful were permitted to serve the prince. If a guard developed a limp, he was quietly reassigned to the outer perimeter, miles away. If a dancer showed the slightest wrinkle of worry or the tremor of early illness, she vanished from the inner court, replaced instantly by flawless, youthful perfection. This inner circle of Kapilavastu became a terrifying, beautiful machine fueled by denial, a court of perpetual youth. It was a horrifying theatrical performance where every actor was forced to smile, forever trapped in the king's desperate, gilded narrative. Siddhartha's life was an endless loop of festivals, feasting, and musical performance, designed to keep his mind busy, happy, and entirely focused on the superficial joy of the moment. He was showered with silk, jewels, and attention, raised in an environment that made the idea of wanting for anything not just foreign, but impossible. The concept of lack simply did not exist within the golden walls of his prison. And within this magnificent, terrifying bubble, Siddhartha grew. He was brilliant, absorbing the finest education the world could offer: languages, philosophy, statecraft, and the martial arts. He was a champion archer, a master scholar, and a prince loved by all who saw his radiant, protected face. He mastered the sword, but never saw blood spilled in anger. He studied the Vedas, but never read the passages on suffering. He was a flawless, polished diamond, unaware that the weight of the universe was pressing against the thin walls of his ignorance. Every moment of his life was a highly choreographed stage play, directed by a paranoid king who believed he could rewrite the laws of the cosmos simply through sheer, magnificent wealth. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken fear. The fear that one day, one tiny crack would appear in the golden facade, and the truth would rush in like a tidal wave. But as Siddhartha approached manhood, reaching that dangerous age where curiosity overrides comfort, the king's anxiety reached a fever pitch. He knew the prophecy hinged on Siddhartha's choice, and knowledge was the enemy. He needed a distraction, an anchor, something beautiful and binding, to keep the prince rooted firmly in the material world. He found it in Princess Yashodhara, a woman of unparalleled grace, wit, and beauty, a perfect centerpiece for his golden cage. The king decided that if he could bind Siddhartha to love, to family, and to the intoxicating pleasures of the senses, the call of the forest would sound dull and meaningless. The marriage was a spectacle of impossible scale, a celebration designed to obliterate any philosophical thought. For weeks, the city drowned in music, feasting, and sensory overload, cementing Siddhartha's place as the heir, the husband, the future king. This union was Siddhartha's final, desperate, psychological trap. He gave Siddhartha everything: power, pleasure, love, hoping that this mountain of magnificence would finally outweigh the single, subtle seed of curiosity growing deep within the prince's protected heart. The stage was set, the walls were secure, and the king waited, holding his breath, convinced he had finally cheated fate, unaware that the very perfection he had engineered was about to become the hammer that shattered the golden lie. The moment Suddhodana received the prophecy that his son would either conquer the world as a Chakravartin, a universal monarch, or abandon it entirely to become a Sama Sambuddha, a fully awakened one, the very foundations of his kingdom shuddered. This wasn't a choice. It was a cosmic ultimatum. A king needs an heir, a warrior, a successor to carry the bloodline and the banner of the Shakya clan, not a wandering ascetic who would trade the throne for a begging bowl. The king's reaction was immediate, absolute, and terrifying in its scope. He didn't just build a palace, he engineered a fortress designed specifically to cheat the spirit of destiny itself. This was the birth of Kapilavastu, not merely a city, but the most elaborate, magnificent, and ultimately devastating lie ever constructed. A gilded cage forged from fear and the absolute best materials the known world could offer. Every single brick laid, every shimmering pool filled, every silk curtain hung in the 3 magnificent palaces, one for each season, because even temperature change was deemed an unnecessary hardship, was a ward against the external world. Suddhodana commanded the finest architects, the most astute philosophers, and the most dazzling artists to dedicate their entire lives to one singular tyrannical goal: the total erasure of suffering. If suffering did not exist within those walls, then the prince could never encounter it. If the prince never encountered suffering, the prophecy of renunciation could never be fulfilled. The king believed this was a mathematical certainty, a foolproof equation of control that defied the very laws of the universe. Imagine the sheer, terrifying scale of this endeavor. The walls around the compound were not just high, they were monumental psychological barriers, guarded by thousands of fiercely loyal soldiers whose allegiance was bought not just with endless gold, but with the terrifying promise of instantaneous, silent execution, should any shadow of reality dare to cross the threshold. Nobody aged here. Nobody sickened. Nobody died. At least that was the grand, meticulously enforced illusion the king upheld every single second of every single day. The royal grounds became a perpetual spring, a curated paradise where the calendar was permanently stuck on the most blissful moment of youth. Siddhartha grew up under a sun that seemed perpetually filtered through rose-colored glass, breathing air that was literally too sweet. His gardens were surgically manicured, every flower blooming exactly on schedule, never drooping, never decaying, never showing the slightest indication of impermanence. The staff, thousands strong, were rigorously vetted, their personal histories sanitized to the point of extinction. If a servant contracted a cough, if their face held a momentary flicker of sadness or worry, they were instantly silently removed and replaced, before the prince could even register the slightest sound of distress. This was the ultimate, flawless stage management of human existence. The king ensured that every sound the prince heard was a melody, every sight a beauty, every touch a pleasure, so perfect it verged on the unbearable. Siddhartha was perpetually surrounded by the crème de la crème of youth, vitality, and dazzling, distracting perfection. The most beautiful dancers, the wittiest courtiers, the strongest athletes, all designed to reflect an eternal state of joyous, flourishing permanence. But Suddhodana's obsession only deepened the very tension he sought to relieve. The king himself became the chief warden of this spectacular golden prison. He watched Siddhartha constantly, his own heart consumed by corrosive paranoia. He knew, deep down, in the cold, rational part of his royal mind, that the natural order of the cosmos could not be permanently halted by mere silk and stone. He was fighting gravity, and every day Siddhartha grew older. The gravity of destiny pulled harder and harder. The prince, meanwhile, lived in a world of manufactured, suffocating innocence. He possessed everything a mortal could possibly desire: wealth beyond measure, status, and pleasure tailored precisely to his every whim. Yet, the very perfection became suspicious, unnatural, and suffocating. Have you ever been in a room so silent, so clean, so terrifyingly perfect, that the lack of imperfection screams louder than any flaw? This was Siddhartha's existence. A nagging, persistent, cold void began to form beneath the surface of his gilded life, an emptiness that no amount of pleasure could fill. He began, subtly, to notice the cracks in the king's masterful facade. Why was his father always so incredibly tense, his brow permanently furrowed beneath the crown? Why were the guards around the gates always facing inward, as if protecting the prince not from invaders, but from the terrifying reality of the world itself? Siddhartha's mind was not dull. It was razor sharp, trained by the best tutors in the sciences, philosophy, and military arts. He excelled at everything, mastering complex knowledge almost instantly. But the greatest knowledge, the knowledge of suffering, the root of all human drama, was the one lesson perpetually and violently withheld. The king, desperate, tried to anchor him with the ultimate worldly pursuit: marriage and dynasty. At the tender age of 16, a competition was arranged, not just for a bride, but to further affirm Siddhartha's role as the destined universal monarch. He didn't just win the hand of the exquisite Princess Yashodhara, he utterly dominated the contest. He displayed superhuman prowess in archery, horsemanship, and martial arts, confirming to the court, and momentarily to the terrified king, that he was indeed a warrior king in the making, bound to the throne. Yashodhara was equally trapped in this illusion, a radiant jewel added to the golden cage. She was his perfect counterpart, intelligent, loyal, and devastatingly beautiful. Their union was meant to seal the prince's connection to the material world forever. For a time, it worked. The pleasures of conjugal life, the intoxicating warmth of young love, anchored him further into the life of comfort and predictable routine. The king breathed a sigh of momentary, fragile relief. But the seed of curiosity had been planted long ago, deep within the prince's unburdened, pure mind. Because he had never been taught fear, he had no reason to obey the king's unspoken cardinal rule: do not look too closely. His purity of experience, ironically, made him hyper-aware of the artificiality surrounding him, like a high note only a dog can hear. The walls of Kapilavastu, which were designed to keep the world out, ended up magnifying the world within, Siddhartha's own increasingly powerful mind. If life was truly this effortlessly perfect, why was the effort to maintain it so terrifyingly immense? Why did the laughter of the courtesans sometimes sound brittle and forced? Why did the king's eyes always hold that desperate, haunted look of a man who knows he is losing a war against God? The pressure cooker was now at critical mass. Siddhartha, driven by a nameless restlessness, an instinctual craving for genuine reality that even the king's gold could not satisfy, began to feel the heavy, oppressive weight of his perfect life. He grew deeply dissatisfied with the shallow, repetitive cycle of manufactured pleasure. The golden lie was beginning to irritate him like a grain of sand, and soon that grain would become the pearl of wisdom that would shatter the whole kingdom. He needed to know what lay beyond those colossal walls. He needed to see the forbidden reality. He needed to break out, and the king's paranoid grip was just about to snap. The king was not just a father. He was the desperate warden of destiny, a man utterly consumed by the terrifying knowledge that his entire lineage hung precariously on the razor's edge of prophecy. The ancient seers had spoken the ultimate dichotomy. Either his son would become a Chakravartin, a universal ruler who would seize all known lands, or he would become a world renouncer, a samana, who would abandon the material realm and shatter the power structure of the kingdom forever. This was the cosmic threat that drove King Suddhodana mad. Every single decision, every resource deployed in the sprawling palace of Kapilavastu was calculated with surgical precision to cheat the very fabric of fate. He had to ensure that the prince never, ever encountered the harsh, abrasive, and crucially, temporary realities of human existence. No sickness, no aging, no death, no spiritual seeking. The world outside the towering walls was not just a place. It was a contagion, a poison that had to be kept at bay by unimaginable, spectacular displays of tyrannical wealth and architectural paranoia. The king believed that suffering was the catalyst for renunciation, and so suffering must be entirely eliminated from Siddhartha's view, even if it meant creating a flawless, beautiful lie that spanned acres. Suddhodana commissioned not one, but 3 colossal seasonal palaces,
each an absolute masterpiece of engineering and luxury, designed solely to neutralize the changing climate and thus eliminate any reminder of the cruel impermanence of nature itself. The very passage of time was meant to be invisible to the prince.
There was the Rama Palace for the blistering heat of the summer, cooled by sophisticated underground streams and filled with rare, exotic foliage that regulated temperature with perfect precision. Then came the Sarama Palace for the dark, damp, clinging humidity of the monsoon season, built entirely of reinforced stone and elevated high above the flooding plains. And finally, the Subha Palace, a spectacular winter wonderland of warmth and gilded comfort, where every chill breeze was instantly banished by roaring hearths, thick imported silks, and carefully filtered air. Siddhartha was moved relentlessly between these magnificent, suffocating cages, never staying long enough to feel the true, harsh cycle of the seasons or the natural rhythm of decay.
The king's control, however, extended far beyond architecture. It was enforced by a ruthless, massive staff, an army of smiling executioners of the truth. Thousands of servants were employed, but their job description was terrifyingly unique. They were strictly forbidden from displaying any sign of age, weakness, or, God forbid, sorrow.
If a servant coughed, they were immediately removed. If a gardener's hand trembled slightly with arthritis, they were instantly banished to the unseen, desolate outskirts of the kingdom, never to be seen again. The palace was not a home. It was a meticulously curated stage play of eternal youth and effortless joy, running 24 hours a day. Sadhudana's magnificent, flawed theory was simple. If Siddhartha saw only perfection, he would only know desire for that perfection, forever binding him to the material, sensual world and the throne. The prince was therefore surrounded by an unceasing carousel of the most beautiful dancers, the finest musicians, and constant, shallow celebration, all strategically deployed to drown out the silent, profound questions already starting to bloom in his isolated heart. But Siddhartha was not just a prince. He was a cosmic aberration, and even amidst the relentless, suffocating luxury, an unnerving stillness settled over his existence. He mastered every skill the kingdom offered: archery, mathematics, rhetoric, military science. But the victories tasted like ash. The endless joy felt manufactured, thin as a layer of gold leaf stretched over iron. His keen, penetrating mind began to notice the subtle, almost imperceptible flaws in the king's desperate design. He saw the frantic, desperate strain behind the smiles of the palace staff, forever trying to look younger than they were, forever hiding their inevitable aches and pains. He felt the immense, oppressive weight of the king's love, a possessive attachment that was dangerously close to tyranny, a love that suffocated the natural air around him. Where were the dead leaves in the garden? The flowers were always perfect, but flowers must eventually wilt and fall to dust. The dancers were tireless, but where was the exhaustion that should follow such relentless effort?
The system was designed to hide decay, but Siddhartha's intuition was rapidly developing the ability to sense the absence of truth itself. As he approached young adulthood, the pressure to secure him became exponential. The king decided the ultimate binding agent must be love, domestic responsibility, and progeny. A massive, kingdom-wide beauty contest was swiftly organized, a magnificent spectacle designed to find the one woman whose beauty and grace could anchor Siddhartha permanently to the throne, trapping him with the unbreakable chain of intimacy. His choice fell upon the stunning and virtuous Princess Yasodhara, a woman of deep compassion and magnificent bearing. Their wedding was the most lavish event the kingdom had ever witnessed, a final, desperate attempt to seal the prince's fate with the absolute chains of domestic bliss and sovereign responsibility. And then came the birth of their son. They named him Rahula, a name which literally meant fetter or bond. The king, in a final act of paranoid control, had literally named his grandson the chain he hoped would keep the world shaker trapped. The logic was militarily sound. A universal ruler needs heirs, a family, a kingdom to protect. A renouncer walks away alone and unburdened.
The palace was now an absolutely impenetrable fortress of pleasure. But within Siddhartha, the questions were quickly morphing into screams of intellectual and spiritual claustrophobia. He was surrounded by abundant, sensual life, yet he felt profoundly, desperately dead inside. He had everything the world could offer, yet he possessed nothing truly real or lasting. The air within the golden walls was thick with the scent of perfume, silk, and colossal deception. He looked at his beautiful wife, his infant son, and the magnificent gilded walls, and realized they were not gifts of fortune. They were the glittering bars of his magnificent cage. The king's system was architecturally flawless, designed to block out every truth of human suffering and change. But the prince's soul, when truly ready, does not need an external teacher. It simply needs silence for the internal truth to finally roar to life. He had been forcibly denied the knowledge of the outside world for decades, but the yearning had now reached a critical, explosive mass. The golden prison, ironically built to protect the throne, was about to achieve the exact opposite outcome. It had incubated a relentless, cosmic curiosity that could no longer be contained. The pressure cooker was ready to explode. Siddhartha decided, with a clarity that finally settled his restless soul, that he could not live another moment under the shadow of this manufactured, beautiful lie. He needed to see the forbidden reality. He needed to break out, and the king's paranoid grip was about to snap under the weight of destiny itself. King Suddhodana wasn't just ruling a kingdom, he was running a maximum security psychological operation designed to defy the fundamental laws of the cosmos. He knew the prophecy, that if Siddhartha saw suffering, he would leave the throne. And that knowledge turned the once benevolent ruler into a desperate, terrified tyrant, focused solely on manufacturing a perfect, impenetrable lie. Every silk curtain, every perfectly timed musical interlude, every rose petal in the palace grounds was a weapon in the king's war against fate, a desperate attempt to keep destiny locked outside the palace walls. The logistical nightmare of maintaining this absolute facade intensified as Siddhartha aged. The walls of the three magnificent palaces, Rama, Surama, and Suba, were not merely boundaries. They were a metaphysical shield, vibrating with the king's mounting anxiety. No one within the royal compound was permitted to display any sign of age, weakness, or even minor frustration. If a dancer slipped, they were immediately replaced. If a servant showed the slightest tremor of illness, they were instantly banished to the farthest, hidden edges of the kingdom, lest the smallest imperfection pollute the prince's flawless reality. Imagine the sheer, terrifying, constant surveillance, a relentless 24-hour scrubbing away of reality, all to maintain the illusion that the world was nothing more than an endless, sun-drenched festival tailored precisely for one man's sensory enjoyment. This was not life. It was an artistic installation of monumental scale, and Siddhartha was the captive centerpiece. He was married to the exquisite Princess Yasodhara, a woman whose ethereal beauty was meant to seal his devotion to the mundane world of royal succession. Their union was strategically engineered to ground him, to provide the kind of earthly bliss that would extinguish the deeper, more dangerous, intellectual curiosity that had begun to plague his mind. But even the intoxicating haze of domestic and material perfection could not silence the persistent, unnerving whispers in his soul. Siddhartha had everything that could be bought, built, or seized, yet he possessed nothing of true value, because the entire foundation of his life was demonstrably, artificially fraudulent. He excelled in every sport, mastered every art, and achieved perfection in every royal discipline, and yet, the moment the lavish music stopped, a hollow, echoing silence would descend upon him.
The king attempted one final, desperate anchor, securing the lineage. A son, Rahula, was born, a beautiful, precious heir, whose existence was supposed to be the ultimate chain, the final, unbreakable link tying Siddhartha to the political continuity of the Kapila kingdom. But to Siddhartha, the birth only amplified the unbearable weight of the lie, forcing the fundamental question: what was the point of succession in a world based entirely on denial?
Siddhartha wasn't merely bored. He was intellectually and spiritually starved. He had exhausted every sensory pleasure the kingdom could offer, and now craved the one thing he had never tasted: truth. He knew deep in his gut that a vast, terrifying, and profoundly real universe existed just beyond those meticulously guarded gates. His mind, sharper than any blade, began to demand answers. he began to demand freedom, not the supervised freedom of the palace grounds, but the freedom to see his own city, the city he was supposed to inherit and rule. The king, cornered by political necessity, the populace needed to see their future ruler, reluctantly agreed, but with catastrophic, paranoid stipulations that turned the royal excursion into a military operation. This was not a parade. It was the highest stakes psychological protection mission in history. King Suddhodana ordered a total, preemptive, and immediate sterilization of the entire planned route. Every street for miles was swept clean of debris, pain, or even the shadow of poverty. It was codenamed Operation Flawless Facade, and failure meant death for the overseers. All citizens who were sick, elderly, visibly impoverished, or physically imperfect were forcibly removed from sight and hidden in specially constructed, guarded enclosures far outside the city limits. Any potential source of suffering, a broken wheel, a beggar's hand, a sign of decay, was ruthlessly eradicated by legions of terrified royal staff working around the clock under the threat of immediate execution. Siddhartha assigned his most trusted and loyal charioteer, Channa, to drive the prince, giving him explicit life or death instructions. Show him only beauty. If he sees anything disturbing, anything that speaks of age or pain or death, you will answer to me with your life, Channa. Do not fail me. The day of the excursion arrived. The sun blazed high, but a strange, heavy dread hung in the air. Siddhartha, mounted on his magnificent white horse, Kantaka, and accompanied by the sweating, terrified Channa, rode out. He felt the nervous, forced energy of the crowds, a high-pitched theatrical joy, and knew the charade was running dangerously thin. But the king, in his earthly paranoia, had forgotten one crucial, terrifying element: the devas, the celestial beings who observed the great drama of the cosmos unfold from the heavens. They knew the world needed a Buddha, an enlightened one, and they were not about to let one fearful mortal king cheat the inevitable destiny of awakening. They intervened, their divine will overriding the king's temporal commands. The air itself seemed to crackle with an unnatural energy, a silent cosmic alarm ringing just outside the gilded gates of the pleasure gardens. King Suddhodana's desperate, fragile peace was about to shatter, not by invasion, but by a chilling, unstoppable reality check. The divine forces had decreed that the game was over, and they were about to introduce the crown prince to the first agonizing truth he had been shielded from for decades. Siddhartha, now a man nearing 30, felt an irresistible, magnetic curiosity that even the sweetest perfumes of the palace could not suppress. He ordered his loyal charioteer, Channa, to take him beyond the immediate royal perimeter, insisting on seeing the real city that his father claimed was so utterly perfect and free of suffering. Channa was paralyzed with terror, knowing the king's decree carried the weight of instant, brutal execution. But the prince's will was absolute, a force that destiny itself seemed to be backing. The thousands of spies, the meticulously placed agents and royal informants who had maintained the seamless illusion for 30 years, failed simultaneously. They could not detect the divine intervention that had strategically disguised a single ancient man, placing him perfectly on the road Siddhartha was taking, right where the royal view was meant to be flawless. As the gilded chariot rounded a corner always meticulously swept and decorated with fresh, vibrant flowers, Siddhartha's eyes locked onto an anomaly, a terrifying blot on the pristine landscape. There, hunched and struggling, was a creature he could not possibly categorize, a man whose skin was stretched tight over bone, whose hair was white and sparse as winter grass, whose frame was violently shaking as he leaned on a crude stick. He looked like a beautiful, magnificent silk garment that had been left out in 1,000 years of desert sun, shredded, brittle, and utterly ruined. Siddhartha, who had only ever known the flawless vigor of youth and cultivated vibrant beauty within his palace walls, was utterly confounded. He genuinely did not know what he was looking at, believing it must be some kind of supernatural monster, or perhaps a grotesque distortion of nature he had never been taught about. "Chana," the prince demanded, his voice sharp with alarm, pointing a trembling finger at the figure struggling to draw breath. "What is that thing? Is it some kind of ghost, twisted by dark magic? Is it a broken man, punished for a terrible crime? What affliction has turned this fellow into such a terrifying ruin?" Chana, sweat pouring down his brow and his heart pounding against his ribs, stammered out the terrible, forbidden words. He had been trained since birth to lie, to distract, to obfuscate, to maintain the great, glorious lie. But facing the prince's pure, innocent confusion, the carefully constructed deceptions crumbled into dust. The truth surged out, raw and devastating, a declaration of mortality that echoed across the universe. "My lord," Chana whispered, gripping the reins until his knuckles were white, risking everything he owned, including his life. "That is an old man. It is the condition known as old age. It is the inescapable fate of every human being who lives long enough. The body decays, the strength vanishes, the mind clouds, and the vitality is violently drained away." Siddhartha felt a cold dread, a philosophical horror that transcended physical fear. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a temporary ailment. This was the universal, inevitable sentence passed on all life, including his own perfect, athletic body, and the flawless beauty of his young wife, and the magnificent, iron strength of his royal father. This was the dark future waiting for the perfect present. The revelation struck him with the force of a cosmic hammer blow. If this decay was certain, if this ruin was the final destination, then what was the point of all the exquisite pleasure? Why the dancing? Why the wine? Why the constant, ceaseless pursuit of ephemeral delight, if the body was just a vessel sailing inexorably toward utter destruction? The journey back to the palace was silent, yet deafening. The golden world Siddhartha returned to suddenly looked fragile, painted, and ultimately meaningless. Every beautiful courtesan looked like a decaying corpse in waiting. Every vibrant flower was merely a moment away from dust. The palace itself felt like a magnificent temporary shelter built on a foundation of inescapable suffering. When King Suddhodana heard the reports, the breathless, terrified reports, that the prince had encountered the dreaded first sign, the king's fury was a terrifying spectacle that shook the very foundations of the royal compound. He screamed, he raged, he demanded the immediate execution of every guard on that route, even though he knew executing the guards could not undo the cosmic damage that had been wrought upon his son's mind.
His life's work, the perfect golden cage built over 3 decades and financed by the entire kingdom's wealth, had been breached by one frail, trembling old man. This was not just a failure of security. It was a catastrophic failure to control fate itself, a clear message from the gods that his tyrannical love was doomed to fail.
The king immediately doubled down on his desperate, tyrannical efforts. The palace walls were raised higher. The gates were sealed tighter with fresh commands. More dancers were brought in, their movements made more provocative. More music played louder, amplified to deafening volumes. More exquisite foods prepared, all frantic attempts to drown out the echo of Channa's terrible, defining words. The body decays. Suddhodana commanded that the prince must never, under pain of death for all involved, be allowed to leave the inner sanctuary again. But Siddhartha was no longer interested in the sanctuary. He had tasted the bitter fruit of reality, and the artificial sweetness of his prison now tasted like ash. His mind was now fixed relentlessly on the nature of suffering. If old age was merely the unavoidable prelude, what greater horrors awaited?
Siddhartha had changed. The carefree prince was gone, replaced by a brooding philosophical titan whose gaze saw through the glitter to the bone beneath. His heart, once so easily delighted by trivialities, now yearned for a greater, earth-shattering understanding of the mechanisms of pain. And just as the king thought the immediate danger had passed, just as he was lulled into a false sense of security by the relentless, amplified entertainment, the divine forces prepared the stage for the second catastrophe. The next sight would strike deeper, hitting the prince with the brutal finality of unavoidable physical agony. The second escape was already being planned in the silent corners of the prince's revolutionary mind, a mind now actively hunting for the wounds of the world, preparing to face the horror that even the mightiest king could not defeat. The sickness that consumes all. King Suddhodana felt the shifting of the tectonic plates beneath his perfect palace floor. The golden cage, years in the making, was rusting from the inside out, consumed by the prince's relentless intellectual hunger. Siddhartha, now in the vibrant bloom of his late 20s, possessed a restlessness that no chariot race or courtly pleasure could soothe. He craved the real world, the world of consequences and sharp edges, and he finally issued an ultimatum to his trembling father. The king, knowing refusal meant revolution within his own walls, agreed to a carefully orchestrated, paranoid excursion. He mobilized thousands of men, not just guards, but cleanup crews,
decorators, and spies, creating a mile-wide sanitary corridor through his capital city. Every crack in the pavement was filled, every beggar was swept away, every sign of decay was violently erased just hours before the prince's gilded chariot was set to pass. This was not a trip, it was a military operation against reality itself. Yet the universe, or perhaps the terrible, relentless force of fate, has an unnerving sense of timing. As the prince's carriage, pulled by 4 magnificent white steeds, rounded the final corner toward the city gates, a sudden, blinding flash of destiny pierced the perfect facade. And there, shambling directly into the prince's field of vision, stood an apparition, something so profoundly alien to his worldview, it stopped the blood in his veins. A man. But this man was destroyed, a ruin. His back was curved like a winter branch, his skin was slack and spotted, and his teeth were gone, replaced by the hollow echo of his own failing breath. Siddhartha stared, his perfect, isolated brain struggling to process the impossible information. He turned to his loyal charioteer, the ever-present Channa, his voice a tremor of genuine cosmic terror.
Jana, what manner of beast is this? Is this some strange curse, some temporary affliction? Why does he move like a ghost and breathe like a dying fire? Channa, whose heart was pounding against his ribs, knew this moment was the breaking of the king's entire life project. He looked at the prince, whose face was pale with shock, and whispered the truth that Sudevrana had spent decades burying.
My lord, this is old age. It is not a curse, but the universal tax on time. It is the destination of all living things. The youth you possess is merely a temporary loan, Prince. We all become this. He felt a chill that no Indian sun could warm. He ordered the chariot to turn immediately, retreating back into the sterile silence of the palace, his mind now irrevocably tainted by the knowledge of inevitable ruin. The palace became a tomb of anxious silence. Suddhodana was hysterical, punishing guards and increasing surveillance tenfold, convinced that he could still erase the memory. But the seed of doubt had been planted, fertilized by the grim truth of senescence. Siddhartha spent days pacing, wrestling with the phantom image of the withered man. He demanded another outing, this time with a fierceness that allowed for no argument. The king, now fighting a losing war against destiny, reluctantly agreed, doubling the cleanup effort, pouring gold into the streets to distract the populace. Channa, what great crime has this man committed that such fire consumes him? Siddhartha demanded, his voice thick with horror. He had seen minor scrapes, but never this agonizing, random destruction of the flesh. Channa, choking back his own dread, delivered the second fatal lesson. My lord, this is sickness. It is the unpredictable thief that steals life and comfort without warning or justice. It respects no palace wall, no royal decree. It can strike the peasant and the king alike, reducing the greatest warrior to a whimpering child. The sheer vulnerability of existence hit him. Old age was distant, but sickness was immediate, cruel, and arbitrary. It was the proof that the body, the most fundamental possession, was nothing more than a temporary, fragile vessel destined to betray its owner. The joy he had felt just weeks before evaporated entirely, replaced by a cold, searing focus on the world's pain. He retreated again, but this time the retreat was merely a preparation for war. The final nail in the coffin of Siddhartha's royal life came swiftly. He knew he had to see the ultimate end, the final proof that the king's paradise was a lie. Days later, under the pretense of a religious offering, he slipped out, his guards now too exhausted or perhaps too frightened of destiny to stop him effectively. They found themselves near the banks of a river where a small, quiet procession was moving with solemn dread. 4 men carried a bundle wrapped tightly in white linen, its shape terribly, undeniably human. A woman wept, a sound of utter desolation that echoed in the prince's heart. "Chana," Siddhartha whispered, his voice dangerously calm. "What is that terrible silence? What are they carrying? And why does that woman sound as though her world has utterly ceased to exist?" Chana did not hesitate this time. The loyalty he held for the king was overwhelmed by the profound necessity of the truth. "My lord, this is death. The body you see is a corpse, and they carry it to the pyre. That person has ceased to be. The breath is gone. The thoughts are ended. The life force has vanished. This is the inevitable conclusion to old age and sickness. It is the final, universal sentence passed upon every soul born beneath the sky." The prince stood motionless. Old age was slow. Sickness was random, but death was absolute. It negated everything: love, power, beauty, and pleasure. The horror was not the decay, but the annihilation. His entire gilded existence, the promise of a future throne, the beauty of his wife, the joy of his son, all of it was meaningless dust waiting for the wind. He had been living in a dream, and destiny had just delivered the wake-up punch. He realized, with stunning, terrifying clarity, that the palace was not a sanctuary. It was a holding cell. The time for decision had arrived. The time for the Great Renunciation was at hand.